And so it ends with like, oh, let's do another race. We never find out who wins. But in Justice League Unlimited, the episode where they visit the Flash Museum, there is a display referencing the race, and it does declare Flash as the winner. So,
I mean, technically, he should never lose any of those races, but Superman's the best. That's all there is to it. The end.
Welcome back to the Men of Steel podcast. I'm Case Aiken, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Jmike Folson.
Welcome back to the show, everybody.
Yes, everyone, welcome back to... I'm getting so much worse at having like opening bits. I'm like, there's a race joke in here, but you say welcome back, and I'm like, I don't know how to make that one connect. Yes, everyone, welcome back. In fact, everyone needs to rush to their seats right now, because today we are having a conversation that is probably not going to be a very quick one, even though it's a very fast topic, because today we are discussing the various races between Superman and the Flash. And to have that conversation, we are joined from the Rolling with Difficulty podcast by Austin Funk.
Hello, thank you for having me. Yeah, rush to your seats and then get comfortable, because I have a feeling we're going to meander through this topic. We are going to take our sweet time. I love to just wallow in something that is niche and seemingly very, very inconsequential from the outside.
I know. I'm so excited to have a conversation about this one, because it's one of those things that is like... So there's a whole bunch of Superman vs. Flash stories, and we're going to talk about a variety of them. We'll talk about many of the comics. We'll talk about some of the other appearances in other media, just because it's worth having this conversation, and because it's a time-honored tradition of the character. But at a certain level, it comes down to they ran against each other fast.
I know.
And generally speaking, the fastest man alive kept his title. So that's going to be an overarching thing. But I'm so excited to talk about this because it is a time-honored tradition. I mean, like going back to, what was it? The first race was in Superman 199, and that was written by Jim Shooter back in the day. So we are talking about a thing that has just gone on for a very long time in comics. There have been tons of permutations of it, tons of interpretations and variations on it. And in fact, one of the stories we looked at was like running concurrent with another variation of it, where it's like, here's a Superman Flash race, and they're talking about a Superboy Kid Flash race simultaneous. So it's the kind of thing that is, it's like every time we jump in on a Superman Flash race, it is a snapshot into this is where Superman is and this is where comics are at the time. And it really is a barometer for how a lot of like the nature of comics, because for one thing, all of these stories are taking place, in various forms years apart, because we get the initial couple of crossovers that happen in the Silver Age, but then we get the post-crisis ones, we get the modern age ones that pop up in there. We get all the different interpretations that show up in the different media, and each of those are linked to the moment in time when they came out. It's a photo finish, like we get to see very much like this is the snapshot of what Superman and the Flash were like at that exact moment. And I think that's like the really interesting thing about this. It becomes a historic record.
Yeah, the why they're racing it. I read these largely in chronological order, and it was super fascinating, like you said, to see the progression of how comics looked, but also the progression of like what constitutes a story, like that you can see the different eras, what they were considering, and like what was important to them, and what was it, the building blocks of those comic stories in each of these decades that had happened. So I thought that was super, super interesting. But yeah, it's super interesting that it's this stock conflict that we keep going back to, because there are a ton of those in comics, right? Like there's a ton of like between two superhero, obviously there's superhero, supervillain, but there's a ton of superhero conflicts that we keep coming back to. And obviously I think that probably the biggest one is Batman and Superman, right? Which is an ideological conflict between like the world is inherently good and our purpose is to like deal with the exceptions, and then the world is inherently dangerous, only constant vigilance, right? It's a philosophical conflict that keeps those two characters coming back, butting heads. And Captain America and Iron Man is kind of another one, but this is definitely like the other kind of superhero v superhero fight where it's the physical altercation, and that's obviously super common too. Like everyone's fought the Hulk. Like how many times have the Thing and the Hulk gone up against each other? Let's see who's stronger. How many times have Thor and the Hulk gone up against each other? Let's see who's stronger. But this one is so specific because it's about who's fast.
Yeah,
and that doesn't pop up. Like there's no Marvel issues about Silver Surfer and Quicksilver racing to see who's faster, right? Like it only seems to be these two characters, and then their legacy characters interacting with each other. That comics is obsessed with racing them over and over. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, in part because Superman's shtick, like, the thing is, Superman, his shtick has become everything over time. But, like, originally one of his shticks was that he ran really fast. Like, that was, like, the faster than a speeding bullet thing is really important to the character. And then you have the Flash, who is the fastest man alive. And so all of a sudden you have two characters who are operating in a shared space in a way that is different than, say, like, Superman and the Hulk, who are, like, different publishers. Like, we have these two characters who are operating. Both are infamous for being extremely fast, and you know what comic book fans love to do is pit characters against each other, and
they do.
And this scenario, it's one that can be done very, very easily because it's not a fight, it's a race.
Well, you can contrive all these different, and we've seen them contrive it. Hell, they've contrived some reasons for these characters to run.
Oh yeah.
It's so funny.
And honestly, they probably put more effort in contriving these scenarios than are necessary, because Superman and the Flash doing a race for charity is like the easiest thing to explain in the world.
Yeah, it just makes sense. And I feel like that's kind of, they go back to, it's the first time they do it is that charity race.
Yeah.
And then, it's what they do in the animated series. It's a charity race. And then in what I think is probably the definitive version of it, which is the one of the issues from Superman Up in the Sky, which I got right here with me, is a charity race, and I think that's kind of like the definitive retroactive best one. And it's just solid. And then from there they come up with the most bizarre reasons to force them to do it.
Lot of aliens and strange magical beings manipulating reality into forcing them to run against each other, it seems.
Space spiders. My one weakness.
All kinds of contrived scenarios there. Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Speaking of weakness, the ways they find to get kryptonite and or red suns into these races, so that they're like, now Superman's, because Barry or Wally, but usually Barry, the Flash, they're like, we can come up with any number of reasons for him. He's got to breathe. He's got to eat. He gets tired. We got any number of reasons that he could mess up. Superman, he really only has the one problem, doesn't he?
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, let's talk about the first race, because I think this sort of will establish a bunch of the things going forward, and does really interesting stuff in a way that I was surprised how interesting I thought the race was. So the first race in Superman 199, which was written by, I believe, a 14-year-old Jim Shooter.
That's what?
Yeah. So Jim Shooter was like a wonderkin when he joined DC Comics. So he was like, I don't want to like get too literal on, or like don't quote me on the ages, but he was a very young high school age when he started working for DC Comics, after getting really into both DC and Marvel Comics, after spending like a bunch of time in the hospital, if I remember correctly from his biography, was brought in and worked under Mort Weisinger, and apparently was like his favorite kid, but Mort Weisinger was apparently a douchebag to all of his team, and so like just like yelled at this kid all the time. But he had this like fantasy in his like junior high of like who would be the fastest between Superman and the Flash, and then very shortly after that he was writing Superman and the Flash and was able to pitch this whole thing. Like Jim Shooter, we got to be clear, when he was editor-in-chief, when he was in charge of Marvel Comics, like he did a lot of good stuff, but he also was very adamant that there were no gay people in Marvel Comics, and was very restrictive in terms of how people ran, because he was inheriting it from Mort Weisinger, who was very restrictive about how people ran. And Jim Shooter, at one point while he was in charge of Marvel Comics, the artists and writers had a party at John Byrne's house, and they burned an effigy of Jim Shooter. So we are talking about a controversial figure who was still working in comics. Like, he's still a writer. I have so many issues of Legion of Superheroes that he wrote.
That's madness. Plenty of guys like that still kicking around, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, like, for better and worse. Like, I think that there's a lot to... I think that he is a controversial figure, but I think still an interesting one. And there's, like, plenty of good stuff that he did. Like, he did a lot of great stuff, especially in this era, working for DC. But, just because the people who worked for him didn't like him doesn't mean that he necessarily was like completely a bad guy. It's just a funny story, in my opinion, at least. But yeah, so looking at this first race, so again, we established it's the charity race. The conflict of it, besides the factors of like how they are different in terms of their powers, which is a big chunk of this book, in a way that is very Silver Age that I love. Like the science explaining of everything in the panels. And by science, I mean like Superman being like, well, I'm heavier than the Flash and I can't run on water, so I have to swim at super speed.
I thought that bit is so funny to me that he has to. They're like, which one of these is faster? Now, one of them is fast enough to run on water, and the other one's not. But it's just a question of which one's faster.
Well, but he's so strong that he can swim at speeds and he can go through the waves. The Flash just run over.
The waves. Oh my goodness, yeah. It's very funny to me that they kept finding ways to flip who is in the lead, because at first I thought like, oh, this is pretty good, because a lot of times it's like, oh, well, it's the willpower, right? Which of course all power scaling in comics is going to come down to the author's contrivance and also like the force of character of that superhero. That's how all of that's always going to come down. They're fictional characters. That's how these power scaling things go. But a lot of times it's just like, well, believing in themselves kind of thing. But I thought it was very funny that they kept switching who was in first. They kept coming up with these good reasons. But the reason Barry always gets in first is that he can vibrate through things. And so it's Barry vibrates through something, and then Superman does something really cool to get back in the lead, and then Barry vibrates through something.
Yeah, I mean, so this sets up, like, the big difference here is that the Flash has all of this precise use of super speed that Superman doesn't, but Superman has all these other powers, and that's the juxtaposition between them in all these races. So that even if you limit Superman's flight, which, it's interesting to be like, oh, flight is the big determining factor in his speed, like, the question is, well, this is the foot race of them, but is Superman faster flying? And then you get into like in outer space, like can you fly at a straight line faster versus like around a curve of a planet? Who knows? Not the point. The point is that the Flash can do all these cool things. He can vibrate through solid objects. He can run on water. He can cut through stuff using his vibrations. He does like all these cool tricks. But Superman's just a goddamn brick that happens to move close to the speed of light at any given time. And so he can move through any surface because he's just a goddamn brick. And he's got this stamina that the Flash doesn't, because Superman is Superman. And so that's the difference between them here. And that, it kind of changes throughout, like, what power set we need to worry about. But the other thing that's important is that they are always close together in speed. Like, there's no version of Superman and the Flash where their speed is dramatically different in a way that, because the Flash is the power scaling of what super speed is in DC Comics, like, and Superman is always just up right behind him on this one. Whatever the speed of the Flash is the speed that Superman goes, basically. And that in whatever version that we're looking at, that is the deal for this character.
Yep, when they're depowered later, post-crisis, like, that they're both slower,
right?
And here they were like, well, obviously you both could go several times the speed of light. No, that's out of the question, But here we put all these obstacles in your way so that you can't do that. I thought that was interesting. Yeah, you're right. Superman is always just like right there. Although it makes sense because you want them to be able to interact during the race, to have them both close together, to both be in the same panel, right? But there is the one exception, which is up in the sky. But we'll get to that, because I think it'll probably be the last one we talk about. But that one is interesting to me because it's the exception. They're really not close together, and it's called out in that issue. They're like, well, close together when you're racing around the world a dozen times at just shy the speed of light is like 100 miles. Like, that's pretty close. But that's not close for panels.
Right.
That's nothing. They're in different time zones, so.
Yeah, and that's actually an area where it becomes weirder, where they're so close together. They're always neck and neck for all their races, even though like the relative difference really should be like, oh, but they are like hundreds of miles apart because that race is so far and they're moving so fast in this whole situation. But this one sets up like, okay, well, this is the dynamic here. That Superman has all these powers that he has to restrict to focus on speed, and he's not as good at speed as the Flash. Like the Flash is always better at speed, regardless of if he's faster, he can do more things with his speed. And then we get the extra drama of like, well, what do unscrupulous people do when there's like big events that have a definite winner? And that's gambling. And like, I actually rather love that like the big plot is that the mob is trying to like fix the match. Like,
two mobs.
Yeah, that's the best
We've
part.
had one mob, yes, but what about second mob?
It's two mobs. And they cancel each other out, which is the best part.
Yeah, exactly. For the power scaling going on, where they're both like, oh yeah, again, like obviously you guys could like, fly fast, go faster than light. No, no problem at all. It's very funny to have their the people who ultimately stop them be just a bunch of goons.
Yeah.
Just some mob guys who put a piece of glass in the road for Flash to run into at full speed.
Right. It's like, oh, well, it's bulletproof glass, but he just like gets it at full speed after having like run through a glacier earlier in the issue.
He just runs into glass.
A lot of these stories are multi-parters, but this first one is just one issue, and it is a dense one issue.
Oh, yeah, a lot. I find myself looking back, like, trying to remember when certain things happen. Because I was trying to remember as I was taking some notes for this recording. Like, sometimes Barry is a huge prick. Am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
Yeah, by all means.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Sometimes Barry is a huge dick. And he's like, oh, yeah, Superman's just trying to distract me. And when it's, like, kind of the Wally version in like the animated series, you're like, well, that's kind of the characterization they're going for Wally. But when it's Barry, you're like, why is this man like so skeptical of Superman? Like Superman's like, Flash, I think there's a trap here. I think I think something's going on. We need to stop and consider it. And Barry's like, that guy probably just wants my city to blow up. Like, have you met Superman?
Yeah, it gets weirder later with all that. Although that's not in this one. That's in the next.
You're right. That's not. It starts to get mixed up in my head though. Like, where is Barry kind about it? Where is he like being weirdly vindictive out of character? Like,
well, this also gets back to a core part about especially Barry, which is my thesis that speedsters are inherently just a variation on Superman, because the power set makes them so impossible to defeat. Like they effectively can do anything, and like super speed is such an important part of Superman's power set that like even if you downplay it, like a speedster can do all the things that you need Superman to do in most circumstances. They can get to any situation fast enough to stop the problem. They can usually fix any problem because they have super speed to afford it. Most physical threats are not real threats to them because they're able to bypass it by way of their super speed. And so ultimately that the Silver Age Flash is a variation on Superman and really leans into here's the science lessons that we can do because of our superpowers, which is a type of story you can do with Superman, but not the sole type of story you do with Superman.
I think you're right. I think the fact that they rebooted Flash with the introduction of Barry Allen during that Silver Age science fiction kind of, the same era that brought you the revamped Green Lantern origin, the same era that brought you the Fantastic Four and all these new like Marvel heroes, where it's Superman has these deeper roots, and so you could do that science fiction stuff. Obviously, he's from another planet, science fiction, but the very specific brand of science fiction, the pseudoscience explanation for why this stuff is happening, is very tied into like the new origin for Barry and for Hal. And I think you're right. I think that's an interesting observation about like how they keep using it to explain Barry's powers, and then for Superman, they're like, you guys, you know what Superman can do. You know his deal. Like he can just do everything. Don't worry about it. We don't need to explain how he has an invisible aura that protects him from friction, because that's pseudoscience stuff that came out in the late 50s, early 60s kind of era of comics, and Superman predates all that.
Yeah. I was impressed that they referenced Flash's aura even in that first race. I was surprised at how many things about the Flash's powers were already in place at this point, which just speaks to like the limits of like how much I've paid attention to Barry Allen era Flash. But at the same time, I'm like, oh no, that actually like is really very prescient for details that would be, built upon with like the Speed Force and everything later on. But here it's just a part of the character, and like, oh, that's cool. Like, like the fact that it's going back to the 60s, like, oh, that's pretty cool.
I was also surprised at, because I've read stuff this far back, but not as like not in any kind of like order or in any kind of bulk, right? I've tended to read things connected to other stories I'm reading, or like I pick up an issue from a thrift store kind of situation. So to go back and read this one and like, man, like, yeah, the aura is really, him vibrating his molecules through matter is really old. They came up with that stuff really quick.
Yeah, it's it's kind of like going into looking at like the Silver Age Superman stuff and seeing how much of it came in just like this limited window of when like Jerry Siegel had come back on the book in like the late 50s, early 60s. And it's just like, oh, this like 6-year window gave us like the bottled city of Kandor, and it gave us all the different colors of kryptonite, and it gave, gave us Bizarro, and all.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing about the kryptonite thing.
I think that kryptonite as a general concept is useful for a lot of storytelling, whether or not either the oversaturation of the types of kryptonite or the oversaturation of the amount of kryptonite. Both of those are problems. But like the inherent issue of kryptonite existing and that there are multiple types is not a big deal. And we'll talk about some of that as we continue in this episode, because kryptonite pops up a lot in this episode.
Shocking.
For a thing that should just be like, oh, but they ran against each other. Like we get kryptonite right off the bat. The mobsters just get kryptonite dust.
Ow.
I know, it kind of just seemed like you could buy it at the corner store, right?
Exactly.
60s kryptonite was ubiquitous. Like that was just a thing.
They had kryptonite like they had lead in their pipes back then. It's just everywhere.
But why don't we move on to the next race, and I think we can kind of lump this one and the one after that into sort of a bigger conversation. Actually, the next couple, because they all sort of follow similar trajectories of like, apparently an alien forces them to run against each other is sort of the theme of the next couple races that we're looking at. It's not always, because the second race between Superman and the Flash, actually it was a plot by the Reverse Flash and Abracadabra, but that is,
love to see some abracadabra.
A lot of abracadabra in this whole conversation.
Abracadabra shows up a lot, and he's in one of my favorite issues with Wally, who's my favorite Flash. And so whenever I see him in the Titans run from like, I forget when, but not pretty recently. But so whenever I see him, I'm always like, hey, yeah, like that dude always is challenged in the Flash. I feel like he does not get enough love for how important he's kind of been to a lot of these stories.
My first time seeing him, so I was like, who the heck is this guy?
Oh, just in general, you weren't familiar with Abracadabra, the 64th century criminal magician who uses technology in the place of science, or in the place of magic?
No.
Okay.
It's super funny too, because they're like 64th century, and the Reverse Flash is already a future supervillain who's not from nearly that far away. I don't think. Like he's like 32nd century or something. Like that.
Where's Booster Gold from?
Booster Gold, I believe, is 27th, and I think Reverse Flash is 25th, but I will double check.
25th? Yeah, that sounds
they were
right.
Right around the same time, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, that's already stupid far in the future. The 64th century is crazy.
Right, which they established is like this like hellscape where everything is so advanced, but at the same time, it's like this massive war is going on. Yeah, 25th century is Eobard Thani.
Yeah, it's a real war never changes kind of thing.
Yeah.
War never changes.
Yeah, so the second race, they run through space, and this one made me think of. Are you guys familiar with the snuck in appearance of Barry Allen in Marvel Comics that happened in the 80s? The buried alien situation when there was a big Marvel race of all the speedsters, and right after Barry Allen died in Crisis, a blonde-haired individual in red rags shows, like, rips through, like, appears in like a bolt of lightning and like joins this race with all the Marvel speedsters and wins. And he's like, I'm so confused. My name is, it's like Buried Alien or something like that. And they're like, oh, Buried Alien, cool. And they like welcome him as the like the champion runner of the Marvel universe. And like he's like shown up every now and then since for a while.
I did not know about that. That's funny. He is a cameo in an issue, or maybe it's Wall. I can't remember now. There's a Flash cameo in an issue of Nova.
Oh, really?
Where like Nova number 4 or something. Yeah, there's a background where it's two guys, a blonde and a redhead, who call each other Barry and Wally, and that's it. They're not superhero or anything. They're just two guys, but That's way more of a cameo than the one I'm
Yeah.
talking about. That's super funny. I didn't know about
Yeah,
that.
especially because it was a big racing sequence where they have like obviously Quicksilver, Makari, the Wizard. They have Captain Marvel. They have Captain Marvel 2, Monica Rambeau's character, who can move at the speed of light, so she's worthwhile there. I forget all the other characters. We all know that the actual so there's the actual fast speed of light characters like Monica Rambeau in Marvel Comics, and then North Star is like the actual fastest character in Marvel. like who's not moving at actual speed of light. He can move like almost the speed of light and becomes more invulnerable the faster he moves. Like he's the fastest Marvel character, but then yeah, Buried Alien is apparently even faster than that.
Buried Alien.
Yep.
We're gonna use that from now on.
A good moniker.
So the first two races end in a tie, which is like kind of one of the things people know about these races, that like for a long time it was just like, oh yeah, it's always a tie. And then race number 3, which is this one's Denny O'Neil, and this one is another Aliens situation comes up, and the Guardians of the Universe enlist the Flash and Superman to run.
To call this one a Flash win is kind of a
this is
that's
a
not
Rocky
really a
2
fair.
win. This is they just barely make it, and like technically it's a win, and it's like, yeah, okay, the Flash is the fastest man alive, he's the winner, but at the same time they were both crippled and barely made it to the end. Like
It's also so funny. Yeah, so I actually think it's kind of a cool plot, because the second one is like the first one, the charity works, good setup. The second one, two villains pretend to be two other different, separate, unrelated villains to trick them into running because they lost their bet because neither of them won the last one, and there's actually all these traps along the way. That's sweaty. That's working really hard. This one I find to be in the middle, where it's like there are these. I like the notion that there's like these beings that are just tearing across the universe, and they're folding time and space. They're moving so fast, and so if they run counter to it, a very Flash thing, run reverse around the tornado, run around the energy thing to contain the explosion, the beam, whatever it may be. Super common Flash thing. Run opposite to whatever this horrible thing is, and you'll prevent it. I mean, Crisis on Infinite Earths, Death of Barry Allen runs around the anti-monitor cannon. So classic stuff. I really actually like that. Then I hate the twist that it's these robots that were created by a bunch of these Kryptonians.
Well, so all right, let's back up for a second. So just to be clear, we talked about Superman 199, which is the first race. We talked about Flash 175, which is the second race, and is fine. We're currently discussing World's Finest 198 and 199, just so that, because I realized we jumped through these all pretty fast. Yeah.
It is a race after all.
And this is 1917 at this point, so it's been we have had a good long run of these characters at this point. So I'm interested in the fact that it is tied to the Phantom Zone. I think that it is kind of cool. It makes me think of the way that the Phantom Zone has been used in various media as a means of warp drive kind of thing for characters, for moving, like jumping around the distance of space, using it for faster than light travel in outer space. So I think that's kind of cool that that's going on in there. And the fact that we've got the super criminals from the Phantom Zone is also kind of fun. They're all theoretically fast enough that this wouldn't be that they could be moving in parallel or perpendicular or opposite direction, and it would be fairly worthwhile, because not only do we have Zod, we also have Jax-Ur, and then we have what was not Kilgore, it's Cruel. It's the last one there.
Cruel.
Yeah.
Clever. Put that one up there with Scott Free.
There's actual Killor. There's Killor
names.
as one of the Marvel, or as one of the Phantom Zone villains, or not Phantom Zone, because he precedes the Phantom Zone. He was frozen in suspended animation in a satellite around Krypton when it blew up, as opposed to in the Phantom Zone at the time. But yes, their names are all over the place, or not all over the place. Their names are all generic and silly. But I find that kind of fun. I do find it interesting that the whole Guardians of the Universe are we're pouring all of our power into the Flash, so that he can run this way. We are powerless in this time. And
sorry, go on.
Well, the whole time I kept on being So what's going to happen?
Yeah, right. So the whole time I'm like, okay, and then we, we're gonna get the additional ticking clock of like, yeah, well, the Green Lanterns need to stop some sort of threat. Never comes up. They just keep reminding you it may be a problem at some point.
It's an unloaded Chekhov's gun.
Yeah, exactly. Two things that I did find super funny. We're talking about like how far back the histories of these things go, and there were two things in these two issues that I thought were super interesting that have come up way more recently, which is one, Barry running on the Green Lantern energy beam, which we see in Justice League, the TV show. I can't remember. I think it's just the regular Justice League, not Justice League Unlimited, where he has to throw something into the sun and he has to like approach the speed of light to do it. That's I was like, oh, that's interesting that idea started here. Like he could run through space because he has the Green Lantern pathway. And then the other thing was in the second issue, Superman and Flash call the Green Lantern amulet to them, which is the thing that just happened in World's Finest in the first arc.
Yeah, we just talked about that.
I was listening to that episode. Yeah, they call the ring to themselves with their combined willpower, and I was like, that's right here.
Yeah,
that started here. Damn it, Wade, once again, you've just plumbed the depths of comic lore. And I thought you were a genius, and you're actually just a different kind of genius.
Yeah, no, Wade is the master of referencing things that are already existing and making you think that he invented it.
Yeah, which good. Because certainly no one was, this was going to be an idea that was lost if no one ripped it off and put it in a modern comic, No one was going to remember the calling the Green Lantern amulet with their combined willpower plot beat. Good on him for using it.
Yeah.
In my estimation, that's just like archaeology. It's putting it in a museum.
It took me a while to figure out that was actually an amulet in the panel. Because it looked like, when I first saw it, it looked like that was like it was a ring on his hand. And I was like, okay, where'd the amulet go? And I was like, oh, that's what that is. Cool. Space.
Well, and it makes sense that the races are either going to be like you have to lap the planet multiple times, or you're going to be in space so you can do a straight line. Like, because they're going so damn fast.
Yeah, it's one of the butts up, again. Apparently everyone wants to see them race. Fair enough, but yeah, butts up against. How are we gonna make that feasibly happen? The same way you're like when you have these like world breaker characters fight each other, you're like, well, we got to put Thor and Beta Ray Bill on a dying, exploding planet because otherwise they'll do a quick destroy an entire civilization. So
yeah,
it's one of those situations.
Yeah, like, depending on how you depict super speed, it's either everything is just stopped and they happen to be able to move through that whole space and it's fine, or it is the most destructive power ever because they have a shockwave that chases after them, destroying everything in their wake. And you could argue that the Flash has superpowers that prevents that, but Superman doesn't. So the race could be potentially quite destructive.
Yeah, they're very choosy with when that sort of thing happens. I always think back to the Justice League cartoon where Flash does the I've never gone that fast before thing.
Yeah.
And he destroys the world. And I'm like, Jesus, is he doing that all the time? Like, clearly not, but yeah, it's a thing that they kind of choose to include when it will be most interesting for him to create a dramatic shockwave in his wake.
I think it's for special emergencies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's like when Superman gives that whole speech about the world being made of cardboard.
Yes. In case of emergency, run into glass plate instead of break glass plate, though.
Why don't we move on to DC Comics Present 1 and 2, which is yet another fucking in-space race between them because of aliens. In this case, the most fascinating part, aside from that we get another race between them, is that we get a race that claims to be the seed parents of both Krypton and Earth. And I find that so goddamn cool because I have this headcanon about humans versus Kryptonians and Daxamites specifically in DC Comics lore, that in my headcanon, all three have this share a same ancestry of colony worlds and that were then in the humans' case, modified by white Martians so that they didn't manifest superpowers. And this kind of confirmed that for me, because that had always been a deal because of the Morrison White Martian arc, where they talk about how the white Martians prevented mankind from becoming superhuman. I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. And the fact that like there's such a similarity, and we know about the relationship between Daxamites and Kryptonians, and the fact that we know that humanity is destined to be the fifth world that manifests superpowers like the new gods. It's always been like, well, yeah, that makes sense. And then this fucking story confirmed it for me. Like, that there's an alien race that used to be one species, and then they split off into two separate species, and both of them seeded their respective planets.
It's some real like Eternals deep like it's like Jack Kirby mythology. Everything is connected, deep nonsense that I'm totally here for. I love that kind of stuff. I love a good explanation for like, you know, we have to have all these superpowered characters, and like we're gonna draw these other heroes to look like people. I love a good explanation for that. So
yeah, I mean, aside from that, like it's, you know, they run so fast they run into the future to get to the past. They do the late Mr. Fry episode of Futurama where they just keep on lapping space-time. But you know, I don't. Yeah, it's another like we've got an alien situation, so you guys have to run against each other. Go. And time travel becomes a big part of this, and so there's yet another Reverse Flash appearance, and in this case also a Legion of Superheroes appearance, which continues the weird situation of Superman in the 70s, or in this case 78, where Superboy and Superman could theoretically meet up. In this case, it's because of time travel being weird, and so they're able to time travel into the same space. But Superman refers to Superboy as just Superboy, like he's like a different IP than like just him as a kid, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, we're talking about young Clark Kent as Superboy. You know, the in, you know, the storylines where he's doing super stuff as a kid, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about, yeah, okay, I figured as much. Some of the my native. So I love the Flash, and that's definitely my favorite character. But in so many ways, my native is comics are definitely Marvel. So sometimes the deep lore confuses me.
Oh, sorry, I'm just referring to the fact that he bumps into Superboy in this story. Is what I was referencing.
That's no, I follow. My dad always had a funny thing about Superboy. She's like, I don't understand. Like, nothing bad can happen to him. We know Superman's fine. Like, why is anyone reading those comics?
Well, but I mean, you could say the same thing about Superman just in general, because that's the whole deal.
Yeah.
And that's
I didn't say he was right about it, but he brought it up a lot.
Yeah. This is a tangent for a Superboy episode, but one thing I do like about young Clark as Superboy is that it does allow him to make mistakes on his way to becoming Superman, and you can always like be like, oh, and Superman would know not to do this, but this is him, how he learned how to make those, you know, or to not make those mistakes in the future. And so I think that that's the interesting part about the character, because like it's always the deal that with Superman, like it's not about him losing a fight, because the only time that ever mattered was Doomsday. Like every other fight is, you know, not an issue for him because he's Superman. so
how old was he when he dated that mermaid girl?
He's college age when he dated.
So that's a lesson that he learned.
That is a lesson he learned right there.
Note to self.
Right. Note to self when she says, like, come and spew on my clutch. It's not a thing you don't want to do.
I think that this detour has taken a very dark turn.
Not dark, but weird. Certainly weird. All of a sudden, we're all banned from aquariums.
Quick, back on the racetrack.
Back on the racetrack. All right, so moving on to Adventures of Superman 463, which is the first race of the two characters post-crisis. And man, is this a post-crisis issue, because they are trying to figure out, and very defiantly announcing all the changes in continuity. They keep on being like, it's not like we've ever raced before.
Yeah. Well, okay, but this is a different Flash. This is Wally now.
That's right? True, but they were referring to Barry in those moments there.
That's true, yeah. So,
but yes, it's Wally, and so that's actually a few very important details. So it is Wally, not Barry, and this is post-crisis and immediate post-crisis Wally, who is supposedly just over the speed of sound at this point. Yeah. It is a dramatic downgrade in terms of power, because writers don't know the difference between the speed of sound and the speed of light and what that means in terms of raw speed. Like, there are cars that have reached the speed of sound. Not like pedestrian car or not passenger cars, not like cars that you can buy, but like there are literal cars with rockets attached to it that have had wheels, but they've been attached to the ground and they have broken the sound barrier. We don't that Nothing can break the light barrier. Like that's as far as we can tell impossible. Like maybe science will change in time, but like current science says that doesn't happen. And like the difference between the speed of sound and the speed of light is so fucking massive.
Yeah, it's orders of magnitude. You're not even talking about the same thing. But yeah, it's just one of their big things in trying to like ground the stakes again post Crisis, and their whole retcon of like Wally is fast because he's a metahuman, but he used to be. But Barry was not human, and so Barry was lending speed to Wally for all those years, so Wally could do the fast things. But then actually, we learned later on that Wally can do those fast things because he is connected to the Speed Force, but he was psychologically holding himself back to avoid filling Barry's shoes.
Yeah.
So we're right in the valley of those two peaks of Wally, where he's just like at his worst.
Yeah, this is in the wake of Crisis on Infinite Earths. He's just not like, this is the era where he's kind of a man whore.
Yeah.
He is not like this isn't necessarily bad writing on the character. Like I actually rather enjoy the concept of just like a shitty dude who's like a young superhero with superpowers. But that's sort of why this race even happens, because they are just really mean to each other. Like Superman's kind of mean to Wally in a way that is like that's weird and out of character for him. But that is very much the post-Crisis Superman before they had sort of found the rhythm for the character. Like he would say some shittier things. And if it was something that like referenced old continuity, man, would he be defiant about it all. Like it's the same thing as like when he was like, I was never fucking Superboy, man. When we looked at the Pocket Universe Superboy character, like he was adamant that he was never Superboy in a way that was like that doesn't require that much energy. And here it's like, we've never raced.
We talk about the contrivance to get them to race, and it's true that there's a lot of like weird alien and villain setups, but a huge contrivance is that these two seemingly friendly people, I mean, like, so Wally has a lot to prove here, so I think that kind of works, but it happens a lot with the early ones of Barry too, where it's like it's contrived that they're just really pissy and really want to beat each other. Like they're just really interested in competitive
machoism. I think it's the least in the first one, but it's like definitely the after one.
Definitely.
Yeah, and the first one, they seem to. I mean, the first one we didn't really spend that much time talking about it, but like that's the one where like Superman stops as Clark Kent to help the Flash so that they don't like bruise each other's ego or anything like that. And that's
they stop
they both do it to each other secretly, because they're both fucking Superman. Like that again, like Barry Allen is just Superman but with only super speed.
I feel like there's actually a good conclusion statement that's about that. So when we get to the end in 3 to 4 hours, remind me about that, because I think that you said something really, really wise there, actually.
But in terms of pissiness, the Wally Superman dynamic in Adventures of Superman 463 it's at its maximum. Like the two characters are both just being super shitty to each other, and I was wondering if it was going to be revealed that Superman was doing it for a plan, and it's not. Like that surprised me more than anything. But why are they racing? It's because of Mr. Mxyzptlk, and that means that this is yet another outside reality warping alien power forces them to run against each other. Yep.
If it ain't broke.
But it also combines it because then everyone gets the bet on it because it's being held on Earth. So it's like the best of both worlds in that regard.
I like how they set up the path that they have to follow, and then the first time that becomes inconvenient for the Flash, they're like, "Don't worry about the path. This path's not important." We just need a reason for Superman not to fly.
Yeah. Now, this one is where they're really leaning into the limitations of the Flash power-wise. So Wally at this point doesn't have a bunch of the Flash powers because his speed has been reduced so much. But the biggest thing is that his metabolism is really at high speed.
Yes.
Which is a newer concept in the 80s. So like the first major speedster that like really required food to function was the Blur from Marvel Comics from the New Universe. And that had been fully embraced by this era of the Flash, where he has to eat a certain amount of food to be able to function and to be able to keep running. So they're like people handing him off food as they go, and that like it's a really funny detail. And meanwhile, they're really leaning into the Superman is powered by the sun, thing in this era. And so he talks about how, like, oh, my stamina, like, I'm eating, but it's because I'm just absorbing solar energy. And so that really sets up the difference in their power sets here, like where the Flash doesn't have the stamina that Superman does, but Superman's also not a runner.
Yeah, they mentioned that multiple times. He's like, yeah, I fly places. I don't do this whole running thing. So this is actually kind of uncomfortable,
like, especially like as long as
which
he's
is an
doing
interesting
it, you know?
Angle.
Yeah, it's a really interesting angle. Sorry, I cut you off there.
No, you're good. Yeah, it's I think it's an interesting angle because you have to come up with a reason for there to be conflict, and I think it leans into the like godlike aspect of Superman, where it's like, okay, he can do all these things, but at the end of the day, he's always flying, and this is kind of a down to earth, very human way of getting around, and so he kind of struggles, maybe not the right word, but he kind of struggles with it a little bit. And yeah, Flash is like debilitated at this point in the comics by the metabolism. Like, I think he sleeps like 14 hours a day or something too. It's a whole plot point in his solo book where like he can't keep a job because he has to sleep all the time.
Another version of
well,
Peter
they
Parker.
were leaning into it, and I've made comparisons between Wally and Peter before, actually. Like, when Wally is more of an everyman character, like there are kind of vibe relations between that, and you could have an Uncle Barry, Uncle Ben comparison there.
He also has to say with great power.
He's got great power, and he's got a great responsibility to use it.
With great speed, Barry.
With great speed, Wally, comes great responsibility. Yeah. One last thing I do want to bring up about this one, besides the fact that it's a Mr. Mxyzptlk appearance, and we are due for Mr. Mxyzptlk episode just in general. This is the appearance of the Crimson Kryptonite, which is not red kryptonite. It is specifically kryptonite that Mr. Mxyzptlk makes that is red, but when he uses it, it actually drains Superman of his powers when it is actually used. But it is like very clearly a magic thing that is. It's a whole arc where Superman loses his powers is what happens, but it's introduced here, and it will later come up in a couple months in the Superman books at this time. So it's fun to see that little appearance there because it was like, oh, that's where the Crimson Kryptonite shows up for the first time.
They did have gold kryptonite in one of these.
Yes.
The one where the fake aliens make them run. They introduce. I love when they do this. They do this thing in comics sometimes where they'll introduce a power, because they're like, this is a great way to get out of it, but they don't want to deal with the consequences of that power being a thing, so then they'll immediately nullify it. My favorite example is She-Hulk turning back into Jen Walters in this one to escape this one issue, to escape this cage, because she can fit through as Jen, but there's so much radiation that when she's done and she turns back to She-Hulk, she's stuck as She-Hulk. It was like, man, that was a cool thing that you could do that one time that you brought up today, and now it's done. But they do that with Martian Manhunter, where he turns into a copy of Superman. He's like, yes, I was able to resist the fire because I had Superman's invulnerability, a thing that would have been very useful to have a second Superman many times, I'm sure. But now that I've been exposed to gold kryptonite the first time I did it, the powers of Superman are permanently drained from me, and I can never do it again.
Thank you for bringing that one up. Yeah, that was a moment there where I'm like, what the fuck power are we even dealing with here, Martian Manhunter? Like, this is a character who they just love inventing new powers for, but like, are you saying that Martian Manhunter has been able to mimic anyone's powers? Could he mimic a different Kryptonian that has not been exposed to gold kryptonite? Could he?
Yeah, a great question that no one considered. What about the Flash?
Could he be the fastest man alive? The fastest Manhunter alive?
It makes me think of Morph in the new X-Men 97 show, where every time Morph turned into a new character, I was like, you weren't opening with that? Like, they turned into Colossus. I was like, why aren't you always Colossus? Yeah. And then they turned into the Juggernaut. I was like, wait, you can do Juggernaut? Why were you wasting your time on Colossus?
Canon, to be fair, is that it does seem to be all physical powers that he takes on, and it might just be that he becomes big, bulky forms that happen to look like those things, and it's still like...
That's true, but they become Quicksilver and so fast.
So, you know...
and it's like, well, that's a physical power, but that's the mutation physical power? So it's like... I don't even. I have no idea. It's every time though they became a new character, I was like, that's crazy. You weren't opening with that the whole time.
Well, yeah, like, why didn't you open with the super speed?
Martian Manhunter.
Yeah. So the Martian Manhunter, it's like you weren't opening with becoming a second Superman every time you had a problem.
The other side of that is his powers are already close enough. Like we didn't look at the Morrison JLA opening arc with the HyperClan, but there is a great race sequence in there where Flash takes on Zoom, spelled Z-U-M, but U with an umlaut. And that character, who is a Martian who is pretending to be a speedster, like, their race is really good between them. And one of the points of the difference is that Zoom is a Martian, so he has all the Martian powers of super strength, nigh invulnerability, Martian vision, shapeshifting, etc. Even though he's pretending to be one non-shapeshifting character who's just super fast, he is very much a super strong character who is thinking tactically with his super speed. There's good uses of it, is what I'm getting at. Moving on to DC First, Flash Superman #1, which is a race actually between Jay Garrick and Superman. So getting back to this is like all snapshots of when these races happen. Superman has a black S. Jmike, do you know why Superman has a black S in his costume at this time?
I mean, it's 2002. It could be anything.
It's 2002. It could be one specific thing.
I hate pop quizzes.
Is it like the black suit where he's supposed to be absorbing extra solar
no,
radiation?
So this is actually a period right after Our World's at War, which was the end of the Jeff Loeb era for Superman. And so in the Siege of Earth by Imperiex, who is like a Darkseid style villain, Jonathan Kent dies. And so Superman takes up the black S as a sign of mourning for his father. So this is happening at that period. That's why I bring it up. Just
totally do that the entire time.
Now we'll look at the Jeff Loeb era at some point. We haven't really in this series so far, but that is what comes right off the Triangle era. Some people consider it the end of the Triangle era. I consider the Triangle era to end, and then the Loeb era continues, even though they still use the triangle design for keeping straight which issues. Not the point. Anyway, getting back to DC First, Flash vs Superman. So Wally gets infected by nanobites by Abracadabra. Again, Abracadabra. Hey, hi.
Boy is back in town.
And he forces Wally to run, but he's aging super fast. And either Superman or Jay has to catch up to Wally to take on the quote-unquote curse and then sacrifice themselves. So this is actually an interesting setup for a race where they both have incentive to do it because Superman thinks that he won't die because he's Superman, and Jay kind of wants to die because his wife has cancer and he's like having issues. Like he's kind of suicidal himself.
Yes. Yeah. It's I think it's a great setup because then there's the twist on why Abracadabra needs them both to run, or all three of them to run, which is to break the time barrier so that he can go back to the future. The reason that he needs more tech, I think, is kind of weak. I think we could have come up with a better reason that he wants to go back.
It's weak, and you know what? It's super weak because it occurred to me that this means that this is not that long after Underworld Unleashed, which was the big crossover where all the DC villains sold their souls to Neuron in exchange for different types of powers. And Abracadabra,
like you do,
explicitly was the main, like he's the spokesman. He's the actual person who like opened the presentation by Neuron to all the DC villains, and he reveals that he traded his soul for actual magic at that point, in addition to his tech that resembled magic. So like him needing to go back to the future just to get more weapons doesn't make any sense because this is an era where he actually has real magic built into it all.
Yeah, the reason is weak, but the notion of I need all these speedsters to run and I'm going to use their psychology against them, I really liked that because it felt now like we actually had a mastermind playing these characters instead of the kind of trying like, oh well, we're going to destroy Metropolis or Central City if one of you loses, if you tie, we'll destroy both of them kind of thing. I like this where it's like, well, Barry is dying and they both feel it's deeply their responsibility, Wally, to prevent that from happening. They're both like insistent on winning this race in order to like take on that burden, and because of course Superman would, and then again Jay for the reasons that you said, where they're like in this issue. The conversations in these issues are so much more interesting. That's how it goes. The melodrama is much more interesting than who can punch who harder, and in this case, who can run faster than anyone else. I really like the conversation about how young Jay is staying and how that's weird to him, and he's lost lots of things, but this notion of he was fine losing all these very important things to him because he had his wife. And now that, his wife is dying, he's really lost at sea and does not think that he's like, that was the one rock, that was the Flash characters all have their lightning rod. It's a super important part of the mythos. That's his, and he's flailing without it. And so this self-destructive race for all of them involved, and all of it because this perfectly masterminded thing to make them all break the time barrier together. I thought that was actually very clever, great justification.
Yeah. And also it's a fun pairing in terms of getting Superman versus Jay Garrick, who they hadn't actually raced against each other before. And Jay Garrick is infamously he's got better acceleration than Barry ever did, but his top speed has always been lower. And I find that kind of fun to be like, oh, what about this Flash? Like, how does that compare with each other? Is a nice moment there. It's also a nice refresher to be like, oh yeah, so Bart is living with them at this point in the series.
Yes.
It's a reminder of that. This is far enough into the Impulse run where Max Mercury has been lost to time and will eventually show up again, but at this point he's now living with Jay instead. So that's another little tidbit in terms of like what's going on with the characters. Let's see what else is going on with them all. Yeah, I mean, it's again another like we've got a race against these characters and it's being orchestrated by a reality warper. In this case, it's Abracadabra instead of Mr. Mxyzptlk. But what is Abracadabra if not the Flash version of Mr. Mxyzptlk?
It's true. He does seem. I mean, like Mxyzptlk has a lot of functions, but you're right in terms of reality warper, and then in terms of like just kind of wanting to mess with the Flash, like obviously Eobard Thawne wants to torture the Flash.
It was me, Barry.
What's his name? Hunter Zolomon is obsessed with making Wally faster, so there's kind of that like challenging him aspect to it. But yeah, I think you're right. The terms of like maniacally cruel, but like not super malevolent, but malevolent. I think you're right there. That Abracadabra is kind of that character.
It's reality warping puckish character.
Yeah, puckish.
And I enjoy the way they depict the Abracadabra like science tech in this issue. I think like Geoff Johns does a very good job of articulating how it could function, especially with Abracadabra being like the code word. It's like the Alexa, do this. So fun stuff there, and it's a good pairing and good drama, like a lot of stuff to really enjoy with us all. So Pied Piper. So my big era with the Flash was Wally stuff, especially the Mark Waid era of Flash stuff. Is Pied Piper just back to being fully a villain at this point?
I suppose so. It certainly seems that way. Like, yeah, my knowledge of Rathaway was always that, yeah, like he kind of was bad, then he turned good, and so I feel like he hasn't come up a lot in the modern era. I don't think. I'm trying to remember. Like the last time. I'm sure he has been around more often, but everything starts to blur together because it's the Flash. But I'm like trying. In New 52, he was around and he was like kind of like a good guy, kind of anti-hero kind of thing. I think that's like the last big thing I can think of with him. So yeah, I guess he's bad here. I don't know.
I was just kind of bummed about that because he was like such a friend to the Flash in the Mark Waid era, and I was like, oh. Yeah,
he's a cool character.
I did enjoy the convention of him stealing like a little piece of a cane in order to make a rat whistle.
Clever.
Like, that's fun.
Again, making like this issue is actually mostly pretty clever and well written. That does feel like a thing that this character would be able to do, like conceive of, and yeah, take this opening.
Yeah, pretty good issue overall. Moving on to Flash 209. Again, getting into the snapshots of these characters. Now, this one's not a proper race. It is Superman trying to catch up to the Flash, who has wiped everyone's minds by way of Hal Jordan's Spectre, Spider-Man style. And the Justice League approaches the Flash because it's like, hey, all of our records are wiped and all of our memories have been fucked with, and we know you did it. What's up, man? And he's like, I don't have to tell you anything. And Superman's like, I'm going to stay with you until you tell me something. And it's just like, fine, fuck it. And it's kind of a nice moment. Like Superman, like trying his damnedest to keep up. Like that's pretty good there. And we get some nice Howard Porter artwork on this. Howard Porter is a great Flash artist. When he was working on JLA, he did a bunch of interviews talking about how like the Flash for him was doing the Ray, but on the ground, and the Ray was like the book he broke into comics with, and so like that like streak effect for characters is something he's really good with. And yeah, just the Flash looks fantastic. Speedsters in general look fantastic with Howard Porter art, and that's just a thing I wanted to mention because it looks really goddamn good.
I think this is probably my second favorite of all these race issues, and again because the reason for them quote racing, it's not really a race, but Superman's trying to keep up, is just really it's a good solid Superman thing, which is like this Wally's being difficult because he's having the worst day of his life. Yeah. He's going through it, and I like that it's a very Superman thing to do, to be like, I'm not gonna leave your side, man. I'm gonna run faster. I'm going to do the impossible. I'm going to keep up because you need someone there with you. And then when Wally finally stops, they're there to talk, not as Flash and Superman, but as Clark and Wally. And I found that conversation to be really interesting. There were a couple dialogues in these comics that are really interesting. One was the Flashes that we just talked about. The second one, I think, is here talking about how for Clark, things got easier when he married Lois, because everyone was like, well, she's married to this Clark Kent guy. Like, we could just leave her alone from now on. But that's not how Wally, so his burden was lifted. Wally's burden got heavier. And he was like, yeah, but it's kind of like a burden shared is a burden half is kind of the thesis of that issue, as he goes around and reveals everything to everyone. And you get this great everyone coming back. Oh my goodness. And it's talk about another, thing that I didn't realize was something from more modern comics as a reference. You get the Superman's eyes widen and he says Wally as he remembers Wally when Wally takes his mask off. Spider-Man deal with Mephisto style. He takes the mask off, everyone remembers. A reference to the Rebirth issue where no one remembers Wally, and then he goes to say goodbye to Barry. One of my favorite pages, a very emotional, like, you taught me everything moment was a gift, that's why I'm going to leave with happiness in my heart, not sadness. And then the same exact panel, Barry's eyes widening, Wally recognition. I didn't even realize that was a callback to this. Man, I love comics.
Yeah, they're so weird. Like, again, also snapshot of time. So there's the whole, like, the Flash, like, rewrote everyone's memories. The way he did that was by way of Hal Jordan, who at the time was the Spectre. Yes, just in terms of, like, comics are fucking weird, man. This is after Hal Jordan died by way of being Parallax and restarting the Sun. Mm-hmm. Then he became the Spectre or the host of the Spectre. Yeah, Spirit of Vengeance. Yes, and for a time was that entity, and because he had been Parallax, people didn't trust Hal Jordan, and thus when Wally went to Hal, the rest of the league wouldn't necessarily trust him. So yeah, just an interesting bit right there for the character.
Yeah, definitely super interesting. And I find it's part of the Wally trying to live up to the reputation that was what makes the Wally character so interesting, trying to keep everyone safe. He's just always blundering, and not in a like, man, this guy is a dumpster fire Scott Lang kind of way, but in a like, this guy is really just trying to live up to a legacy. He's good deep down, Peter Parker kind of way. Yeah. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's so much going on with him in this issue. Like, God, there's so much text because there's so much inner monologue in this issue for the character. But yeah, like the loss of the twins and all this stuff. Like, I mean, the superhero soap opera will make this complicated to explain beyond, for like what happens after it. But it's certainly a moment in the character where it's just the darkest hour for him.
Yeah, and how appropriate that Superman is here for him, Superman is doing his best to keep up, the comics that they're most interesting when the physical tasks that the superheroes are doing are manifestations of their inner turmoil, and it's Wally unable to, stop and recognize what's going on. He's like still moving, he's not taking stock or anything like that, and it's Clark trying to be there for him. And it's just manifested through these super heroic feats.
Yeah. Moving on to the next story, or like the next kind of sort of race for the characters. I didn't bother rereading The Flash Rebirth #3, which is where we get the infamous scene of Barry saying to everyone, or to Clark, being those races were for charity, and then just like blitzing away. It's an Ethan Van Sciver book. I don't really have much desire to reread anything that he drew unless
we talked about crappy guys in comics, like that's number
Right.
one with a bullet, right?
So I didn't have much need for it. It's also Flash Rebirth, which I don't really like that Flash was reborn. I think that it should have stayed Wally, and the fact that it became Barry, I think, has really muddied the waters in a way that isn't really productive for the character. And yeah, that's how I feel.
Yeah, even now it's difficult for me because Flash Rebirth was my on ramp into reading Flash comics. So for me, it was super special for a really long time. And so it really sucks that I don't really super want to revisit it because of the creative team. Yeah, so I have complicated feelings because I've been reading, I don't know if I like really listed my comics credentials at the top, but my dad was a comics collector, has been his whole life. He's got Avengers like 1 through 300. He's got Captain America 1 through several hundred. Like he's big. He's got tons of stuff, and those were my bedtime stories growing up. You know, like I've heard everything from the Silver Age because he would tell me it all the time, and it was like, well, actually, you know, this, that, and the other thing. But I didn't, and so I read a lot of old stuff, but I didn't really start collecting my own issues until I was a teenager. Which, I mean, what else? When you have money, right? That's when you start collecting your own stuff. And so one of the first things I bought, I think I bought it at like it might have been a convention. I found those 6 issues, and I had loved Flash as a character on the cartoon, so I picked that up, and that was my like on ramp into like Flash is my dude now. He's not just a character I love; he's the character I love, and so it's kind of sucks to have that complicated relationship with it. And I also agree that I think I like Barry as a character, but it's kind of only muddied the waters, especially even now, like looking at the the Flash family is one of the more interesting things in DC Comics, I think. And so in some ways it's nice to have him back because he's a part of that, but in other ways it's like there's too many guys in red.
Yeah.
There's just too many of them.
The Flash like makes it so much harder to deal with. And like I this gets so complicated because really shitty people get involved on certain sides of the argument where you're like, oh, but can we just have some nuance here for some of these characters? Like, it is complicated having a lot of characters having the same code name. Like, that's just the thing. And like, yes, it is fine for certain types of characters like Green Lantern, where they just become known by their actual name. Some characters, it's just more difficult to make that happen. And even characters who are legacy characters like the Flash, like it feels weird when you have a bunch of them like operating simultaneously. Like Jay Garrick as like a retired Flash who every now and then helps out is one thing. That is very different from like, oh, but we also have 2 current Flashes and also kind of sort of 2 current Kid Flashes.
I was gonna say, and there's Kid Flash too, which is not a distinct name. I've always loved the name Kid Flash because it's like so ridiculous and dumb. Side note, at the request of my fiance, who has been rereading the new Teen Titans, she thought it important that I brought up that they often call Kid Flash Flasher as a nickname, which is delightful and stupid.
Really?
But yeah.
This is the Marvel Wolfman era.
Yes. Yep. They've all got nicknames. Kid Flashes is often Flasher. Not well thought out on that one. Marv.
Also, the person who wrote the infamous panel where it's like you always make fun of me for being a Midwest conservative.
My fiance sent me that screenshot as soon as she got to that, since she knows I'm a Flash fan, and I was like, yep. I mostly just retcon that out of I mostly just believe that that's been retconned
or that
away.
He progressed because like. Yeah, Wally having a shitty conservative dad is actual canon, so it makes sense that him developing as a person over the course of his life would happen, especially like mid 70s, like 70s, 80s. So I guess New Teen Titans was mostly mid 80s. Like there's a pretty strong Reagan wave that people hadn't realized was as insidious as it was. If we want to go into a big political, diatribe here, which, hey, this is the Men of Steel podcast, and thank you for coming. So
hey, who's more political than Superman?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So yeah, I find it as less of a weird situation for a character to be like openly conservative in the era of pre-now, but especially pre 9/11.
Yeah, there definitely is a different connotation, and like we have a hindsight, and of course it's like people should know better, right? It's not like, oh well, that was the time. At least say like, oh well, it was a product of their time. It's like, well, it was a bad product of their time then, right? because a lot of people were saying this is bad at the time. But I do agree that, especially because he's a young character, it makes a lot of sense for him to be there. And the whole, when he takes a post-crisis, when he takes up the mantle of Flash, is about him unlearning all of that garbage. You know, all of his selfishness and all of his, like, he's selfish, right? That's the big part of a character.
Yeah, so I'm cool with a character who grows over time, and that's a thing I like about Wally, and that's what kind of a bummer about losing Wally as like a main character, even if they keep trying to make him sort of the lead in some of the books and not all the books. You know, whatever they're doing to sort of.
Well, he's the Flash again, so
yeah,
he's the only one
for the moment.
For the moment, we'll see what happens there. They destroy. I hate the white eyes. Can't believe they brought back the white eyes.
Really? Okay.
I don't like the white eyes at all. And and then now he's got a new costume that I also don't think looks very good. I like his combo Kid Flash thing that was like, it was all red, but his hair was still out. I think he's got red hair. It's iconic. His hair should be out. That's just me.
This is a big deviation into like Flash costume stuff, which I feel like I want to have with you, but is
it's
too
okay.
much
Sorry,
on
we're
this.
so off track. We're so off track. I knew it would be. I'm a real yapper.
No, but I love it because I do have strong feelings about the Flash costumes. Like, I don't know, like when Flash is the Flash, I don't think he should have exposed hair, because I think when Wally is the Flash, like he's the Flash. Like the Flash, I don't think should have the exposed hair. But when you have Barry running around and Wally running around, I'm like, yes, no, I obviously have the exposed hair, because then that makes sense to distinguish him from the looks. Now, the white eyes, I feel, is iconic to the Wally West is the Flash costume.
It's important because it distinguishes him, right? Like
it's
in that
like
way, it's important.
The V belt, you know, like.
It's like the V belt, yeah. But the V belt is better than the circular saw belt, you know.
Right. It's the superior look part right there. Hey, why don't we jump on over to Superman 709, which is not really a race per se, and I was so mad that I had to reread this issue.
This is a weird issue, if I'm thinking of the same one.
So there's no reason that I should be mad that the way that being mad about like Ethan Van Sciver. This is just part of the Superman Grounded storyline, which is the story arc that Jmike Straczynski wrote on Superman, where he decided just to walk across America for about 12 issues, and while he was doing it, kept stumbling into Kryptonian artifacts that were everywhere. And so in this scenario, he stumbled into a Kryptonian artifact that was a headband of memory for Kryptonian shit that the Flash had put on by accident, and was now running...
Well, by stupid is why he put it. He was like, I just had to try. Come on, Barry.
Now, I like some of the
Wally,
bits.
No, it is Barry.
It is
again,
Barry again, and it's very definitively Barry. Like the writing,
it's importantly Barry.
The writing feels like Barry. The fact that he's feels weird about being Bart's grandfather is there, and like that's kind of cool. I like those moments there. And Barry makes sense as a character who would run around just spouting fiction, or not fiction, but spouting historical trivia. Like, you know, that just sort of makes sense for the character. Like,
he's a big dork.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of enjoy the trivia. Like, I enjoy the bit of like the sign of a Kryptonian free man is like the headband. Going back to like
there is
that
interesting
Jor-El
stuff in there.
Bit, and like the House of El, and like the sort of like Etruscan Roman, like we freed ourselves from alien overlords kind of thing was cool. Like I dug it all.
There is really cool stuff in there. The notion that Flash put on a headband and he is now doing like a history show, middle school pageantry where everyone's in costumes.
Yeah,
that I could have left.
I mean, it was certainly a dramatic moment where all of a sudden everyone was wearing costumes, but then they were like, these feel like slapped together.
Yeah.
Like very pageantry. Okay, cool. And so Superman catches up to the Flash, who's like running rampant, and he's like, I was trying to let you catch me, which means that this race doesn't really matter. And what matters more in terms of the actual races that we're talking about is an issue that I didn't read for this, which is I believe it's the relaunched Superboy series number 5, where Superboy races Kid Flash.
I did also skip that one.
And when I say I skipped it,
I'm glad we all decided that was auxiliary.
There are so many adjacent races that we could discuss.
Oh yeah,
there are Bizarro Reverse Flash races, there are Kid Flash Superboy races, there are Flash Superboy races, there are Superman Kid Flash races. Like there's stuff out there that we could look at, And again, then at that point we start getting into the like, well, what about the time that the Flash raced against someone else who was like really powerful in a cool way? Again, I referenced the Zoom race from JLA issue 3. So like we could go down this line because the Flash shockingly runs against a lot of characters who are super fast. Like that seems to be his deal, especially on the TV show. So like you know, if we wanted to like look at every race the Flash has ever done, this would be a different podcast. But in looking at these, you know, sure, there's ones that like kind of feel like we should probably talk about them, but you know, what are we gonna do? Superboy's not that fast.
Yes, we will. No.
I don't know. This one made it into the list of like races, but it's not really a race. Superman catches up to it. Like we also didn't look at the issue of Justice where Captain Marvel has to catch up to the Flash, and like it's the same situation where it's like these are all just kind of times where the Flash has been moving very fast and someone had to catch him, but he had enough free will to restrict it, so it's not like it really is comprehensive. In fact, he goes out of his way to be like, I let you catch me. I let you catch me.
I was holding back. I mean, the same thing happens with Jay Garrick, where Jay Garrick steals Superman's speed. A thing that comes up in the issue where Superman and Wally are racing, and he's like, I could steal Superman's speed right here with the Speed Force, but then he would be a, like, indestructible brick hurtling at 1,500 miles an hour through the planet and would destroy a lot of things. But yeah, so it's like he cheated and steals his speed. You know, we got to leave the door open for anyone to be faster than anyone in the future. So yeah, but Barry was holding back so that Clark could catch him. Much more interesting, I think, is the conversation in this issue where they talk about legacy. And Superman's like, yeah, I never really considered it. It's to me, it's like this a weird contrivance just builds up a good conversation, which again is like that's the way more interesting part of the comic is these two characters sitting down and talking and interacting.
Yeah, and so like the Grounded arc ends with this revelation of Superman having the League of Supermen like spawning off of him, which is like very much adjacent to the House of L concept that we have seen more recently in Superman books. Either way, like this idea that there would be like all these Supermen, like the ones that show up in All-Star Superman, Jmike, like that group is this group that they reference that Superman would spawn. And at the beginning of this issue, he's hanging out with what is it, Super Chief, who's like a character who's inspired by Superman. So the Grounded arc ends with this idea that Superman starts a legacy of Superman into the future. And the Flash is, especially since going from the Jay Garrick to Barry Allen transfer, but like especially with the Mark Waid like legacy era for the character, like the Flash is a big fan of the legacy of the Flash name. Like we have a pretty good idea about every single Flash between now and the 30th century.
Yep, I think to me the interesting there's several overlaps between Superman and Flash that make them really similar characters. Like you've kind of talked about, Flash is kind of this version of Superman, but one of the interesting places where they differ, and not always differ because comic books, but is legacy, right? The Flash is a legacy character from the get-go. He's the one who introduced a Flash of Two Worlds. We introduced the multiverse and the notion that Barry is the first of these characters to have been passed the baton and acknowledge it in the fiction. And then he has Kid Flash, a character who has his name. Originally was just the Flash who was a kid. He had the same costume, you know? Like this is the legacy character. All of Batman's characters are like sidekicks to him, right? And they go off to form their own identities. Sometimes Nightwing is the most important, obviously. But Superman obviously expands the Kryptonian, like there's more Kryptonians, but he's like, it always comes back to the last son of Krypton and the notion that like, is he inherently doomed to be alone because of his great power, or does that allow his great power allow him to empathize more and he is like thus more open to everyone else? And so I think that when you put these two characters together and you talk about legacy, and it's like Superman not really considering that he has any, but actually he does because he's so inspirational, and Flash being like, yeah, no, it's a thing I've dealt with from day one. I think that you really strike on like, it's the perfect thing for them to be talking about.
It's the best thing that is part of what is a really rough arc of the character, where Superman Forrest Gump style is just crossing America and dealing with everyone. Like, but the legacy component is an interesting one that is a big part of it, and will be circled back to, because a version of Superwoman shows up and reveals that like there will be this whole like legacy for the character, and there will be a Superman 2, and there will be all of these Supermen leading to the events of DC 1 million, where the Superman of the 853rd century like welcomes back his great a million times grandfather coming out of the sun to welcome everyone into the future. Like, Superman has the potential for that legacy, but he is always the main character in the story, whereas the Flash has moved on, the way you've pointed out. We have Jay Garrick, we have Barry Allen, we have Wally West, as you said, Kid Flash being like just wearing the carbon copy costume, and like having that sense of legacy built into the character. We've seen it, whereas we have been told it's going to happen with Superman. But like every time that they've tried to introduce a character that could be the next Superman, like it always circles back to the original one, because he's not just the original Superman, he's the original superhero.
Yeah. And it's super interesting in this issue talking about like he just has Superboy for the he has Kara, but it's more like she's his cousin. He's less a mentor to her and more like a good friend who has more experience, or really a sibling who has more experience. Connor, or the Superboy, is the first like of his legacy, and he's kind of dealing with it. And he's talking to Barry, who's had Wally, who is this surrogate son for so long, and now his own grandson is here, and so it's like, hey, I'm just getting started on this, having a kid, a superhero kind of journey. How did you handle it? And Barry being like, well, let me tell you how I handled it back then. I've got this whole new problem, which is that my grandson is here, but I'm doing my best. I figured out the first part, so
I have this whole new problem. My grandson is here, and not only my grandfather, my grandson is Bart. Jesus Christ!
I know. Oh my God! To meet your own grandson for the future, but then also it's Bart is
right.
Such a 1-2 punch.
And I love Bart. Like Impulse, the Mark Waid Humberto Ramos run on Impulse is one of my favorite runs of all comics. Like to the point where it's up there in like the top 3 at least.
Where is it that he's like, oh yeah, I speed read all of the San Francisco Public Library or something like that. And
that's like
what was
issue
your favorite
2
book?
of Teen
and he's
Titans.
like, none of them.
That's
I didn't like them.
Yeah, that's Jeff Johns' Titans right after he got shot by Deathstroke.
Oh, good times.
Yeah, that's when he switches from being Impulse to being Kid Flash.
Okay.
Yeah, which a change. The Jeff Johns. I have. Sorry for beating this. Sorry for beating this drum. You can check off your bingo card. The Jeff Johns Teen Titans run is one that I have problems with, because it felt very dismissive of everything that had been right up until that moment, where it was just like, how do we remake comics to look like the 70s and 80s? Like, how do we bring back the new Teen Titans, basically? And so part of that was like, we're going to simplify Superboy by saying that he's a clone of Lex Luthor and Superman, which had not been the situation prior to that. And the way they dismissed it was to say, we never knew who your parents were, but actually we always did. Like we had for a really long time, and it was just like, just say that our information was wrong or that we lied. Don't forget that you had an origin story for the character, and then just pretend like you never did. And then likewise, Impulse became Kid Flash, and I didn't really care for that. Simultaneously, Cyborg went back to his like 80s look, which didn't make sense because his body had been mostly reduced to like just a head inside a techno-organic body. Like all these characters like went back, like reverted into like the sort of look more like the the Marv Wolfman, George Perez era for the characters, or to like fit in better that way. And like, I like the book overall just fine, but it did feel like very like ham-fisted in terms of how they like took Young Justice and beat it into being the new Teen Titans book.
Yeah, well, how do we keep selling comics in a world where we've destroyed the comics selling ecosystem? Appeal to the people who used to read them.
Basically, yeah. Anywho, moving on to Up in the Sky issue 4.
We got it right here, folks.
Nice. So this is a damn good, huge book that is done entirely in splash pages, which is usually reserved for like big fights. Like the final fight between Superman and Doomsday was an issue entirely in splash pages. Here it's the full race.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. I think that this is hands down the best issue of all of the races between them.
You're goddamn right, because Superman wins.
Superman does win. Now, I felt bad saying it. Here's the thing, it's the best one, and it hurts because as the Flash fan, I mean, obviously we're all fans of everything, but as the guy wearing the Flash sweatshirt on the podcast, Flash is not a character in this, he's an obstacle. Right? Like, this is a story about Superman and the triumph of Superman's will, which is what the whole comic, what Up in the Sky is all about.
It's also potentially
Barry is
apocryphal.
just kind of a pain in the way.
Like, and I think that needs to be taken into account as well, because it is a story being told about the race by someone who is hoping for Superman to save her. So the details being muddied, especially for, like, this appears to be the first race, right? Like, it looks like
it does, yeah,
an updated version of that first race with the photo finish line. And you could imagine that anyone could have been like, no, Superman won that race. No, Flash won that race. Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, she's someone who's holding on to dear hope that Superman's going to save her. She remembers Superman winning that race, even though it looked like he wasn't going to, because he had to you know, to screw over Lex Luthor.
to get one. You can't let Lex Luthor win. Come on. I mean, it's just so good. It's another case of, like, the supervillain plotting is clever. I respect that. I feel like it's really easy to do stupid supervillain stuff. And I respect whenever, because here's the thing about writing a clever supervillain. You got to be clever. You actually have to be a writer who's clever. You know, being able to come up with a good plot or write a good line of dialogue is not necessarily clever to make. So I'm always impressed when, you know, it's not crazy, right? It's not like some wheels within wheels, but the notion that he came up with this plan and he knew Superman would hear and it would devastate him is very Lex Luthor. I love that. And I mean, you know, this issue opens with, why are we here on this podcast? The line that starts this issue, which is, there was once a race. I guess there had to be. Like, we just have to. The people in universe and out of universe just have to know, for some reason. It's in our bones. Who's faster? Like, we can't escape it. We just need to know it.
Reminds me of that age-old question: who would win the fight, Superman or Goku? And then we have all those videos about it.
Yeah, we're driven to know.
Yeah. And here's the thing that, like, kind of sucks if we really want to get into examples. Superman can definitely fly faster than the Flash can run. Like, Superman has repeatedly flown faster than the speed of light. Even in the post-crisis era where he was nerfed, he was able to, like, travel, like, interstellar distances under his own power. The Flash is definitely a faster runner, and can run in ways that, like, break physics, and is the barometer for, like, how we gauge super fast characters. So I think the Flash is faster, but Superman probably has a better travel speed, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. It's like, well, the Flash can move so fast that he transcends time, dimensions, and then reality up into the Speed Force. So it's like, I don't know, does that make him faster? Superman flies so fast, he covers light years, but Wally runs so fast, he runs into the outside of all reality physics engine that powers space-time. Like, you know, it's
exactly. Like,
I don't know. Who knows? Come on.
Yeah, because like you said, the Flash should never lose a ground race because he's the Flash, and the Speed Force breaks everything.
Well, and like
it literally breaks everything,
and it behaves differently between the two of them when they go faster than the speed of light. Superman travels through time with a lot of precision when he goes faster than the speed of light. Even in the versions where he isn't able to do so under his own power and he has to have, like, something boost him, he's been able to do so fairly well. The Speed Force behaves differently than a non-Speed Force character, I guess. Like, Superman has his own kind of thing when he moves faster than the speed of light, and versus, like, a Speed Force character, if they exceed the speed of light, goes into the Speed Force and can come out at different points, and there's all kinds of weirdness. However,
there's no consistency.
Yeah, however the writer wants it to be.
It's impossible to exist, and everyone's needed it for different storytelling reasons. So, you know, whatever.
Right.
It's a million different things. It's an afterlife. It's a reality. It's outside of all of the different parallel universes, powering all of them. Like, whatever. Who cares?
Yeah, it's an aspect of the source. It's not an aspect of the source. It's its own thing. There's the strength force,
the force of nature.
Yeah, it's the fifth fundamental force of reality.
Right.
Oftentimes, I think, along with strong, weak, gravity, and electromagnetic.
It's a thing. They could just say it's a thing. It's a comic MacGuffin that we use wherever we need to.
But all of that is extrapolating on the key issues of Superman versus the Flash, where Superman is all of these powers and he's pretty goddamn close to the best at all of them, versus the Flash is the best at this one thing. That one thing has been expanded upon to include this sort of like semi-divine kind of element of it all, but it's still just super speed, like in its purest form. Just like how much super speed, so much super speed that like it becomes God.
Yeah, it's a very deep power set as opposed to a very wide power set, right?
And depth comes from that power, or rather, breadth comes from the depth of that power. Like his durability is up there as a result of his power, but it is super speed first that creates the durability for the character.
Yeah, it's all these retroactive, justifications for how we can get these powers in there. It's like because he is the fast.
Yeah,
there is no one else that is the fast. There are other characters that are fast, but he is
right.
capital letter F fast.
So I want to move on to other media.
Please.
So I rewatched the second season episode of Superman the Animated Series where he has the race with the Flash, which I think we all looked at. I also looked at, just for fun, the fourth season episode of Smallville Run.
I didn't watch the whole episode. I watched the end clip because I find Smallville a little insufferable.
Okay.
I don't like the show, but
I also watched the season 1 crossover episode. I believe it's called World's Finest. It might be called Speeding Bullets, of Supergirl, when the Flash shows up in that episode. Even though that's not really a race episode at all. I was just like looking for like crossover media. And here's a thesis I have about Superman Flash races, that it is an early thing in the multiverse, or in the shared universe, not the multiverse, the shared universe of the characters. Like the race between Superman and the Flash is a really easy one to explain, and so it allows for the universe of superheroes to expand in a way that is additive, because you can all of a sudden have these two characters who are friendly with each other but like clearly have their own respective supporting casts and so forth come together and do a thing, and then kind of part ways and not necessarily need to like always be bumping into each other. It doesn't have to be like a Marvel New York situation where all the characters are constantly on top of each other, but
it's a good source of friendly conflict, right? We don't need to set up huge stakes, but we got some conflict for this 30-minute episode,
Yeah, and we have two different superpowered characters who can exist independently of each other coming together. Like, there is a reason why the first superhero to show up on the Superman animated series is the Flash. Like, that crossover is the first time we get another superhero showing up in that series. Not as long, don't count Lobo. Like,
no, but Lobo's an antagonist.
Right? Yeah, he's a villain of the episode. Like,
a bit like counting Harley Quinn in Batman as like, well, it's because later on she's an antagonist.
This is before the Batman episode. Like, this is the Flash shows up, and it's sort of like, oh yeah, the Flash is a superhero of a different city, and like it makes sense.
I think it's also easy to get people to sign off on using, right? You're like, we're gonna put Batman in the show. They're like, what
editorial
people
is
don't like
very
it.
Cool with it.
And then they're like, what if the Flash? They're like, who?
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
put him
sure.
in there.
Who cares? Then look at the Supergirl.
You can kill him. We don't care.
Well, both Supergirl and Smallville, they're both scenarios where these are the first character that is a metahuman outside. In Smallville, they're like, oh, it's the first time I've encountered someone who has superpowers who's not from Smallville.
Yes.
And then in Supergirl, they're from different dimensions, and that's how they like connect those two characters in the first place. So I think there's something to it that these two characters, like think about this, like Jim Shooter in the 60s was like, hey, I've always wanted to do a race between these two characters because it makes sense. That's the kind of comic book thinking that would become all comic books eventually, but at the time that was a groundbreaking idea. Like, crossovers just didn't exist for characters this way, and like even things like the Justice League, which existed by this point, was like its own book where all these characters came together. They didn't just like show up in each other's worlds all the time. And then this race is like one of the ways that comics like brings the broader universe of DC Comics together somehow. Like, and it's just like a fascinating detail about this thing.
I don't know. Yeah, it's
Sorry, I feel like I've buried
It's
the
not
lead here.
fun-
This is actually my thesis about the Flash Superman races, that this is the opening up of a broader world of superhero stuff when it's introduced. Every time, including the first race in the actual comics, like is an explosion of the shared universe of the character after that point. And prior to that point, it doesn't exist in the same way.
There's a very interesting observation. It's like super curious that it is specifically this. Is it because like it's a friendly competition that allows for it? Is it, I don't know, like the Flash seems to just kind of fit in very well with a lot of other characters. Superman is ubiquitous. He's obviously going to be everywhere. Is it just this perfect storm, this like chemical reaction that can't be replicated, much like the experiment that caused the Flash to get his powers? Is that like,
well, but
is
that can be replicated. It happened perfectly twice.
Well, it happened. Yeah, it's happened a couple times.
Actually, thrice, because of Eobard Thawne.
Eobard Thawne is also, But going off Barry's notes, you're like, if Barry's notes exist and you're able to replicate it, like we should have probably a lot of those guys running around actually. But regardless, yeah, it's super fascinating to me that this is the case and that it's not, like Shazam has the speed of Mercury,
right?
Why not? But it's these two guys over and over again, and yeah, there seems to be just this through. Maybe it's just because it was done first and everyone has been following in Shooter's footsteps there.
The bigger part on that one is also we have to remember what the Silver Age Flash was to comics in general. Like, the Silver Age Flash is the reason why the Silver Age exists in general.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's, in a lot of ways, the representative of DC Comics Silver Age, full stop. Like, he ushered in the new Silver Age. Like, sure, you could argue that Martian Manhunter did. You can make arguments that the first Silver Age issue was an issue of Batman, an issue of Superman. There's all, like where the Silver Age starts in DC Comics is its own thing. But generally speaking, Showcase, what I want to say 5, but I have, or 56, something. What's the first appearance of Barry Allen?
It's a good question. I don't know. It's somewhere around there. Like 56 sounds right. They all start to. I've said blur together a lot, which is appropriate, but
Showcase 4. Okay, so I was closest when I said Showcase 5. Showcase 4 is the first appearance of Barry Allen, and like that is the ushering in of the DC Silver Age. And so the race between Superman, who is the pinnacle of DC Golden Age concept, like he is DC Comics as an institution, and then the Flash is the update for the 60s of that institution.
Yeah, he's that science fiction. He and Green Lantern, and Martian Manhunter, they're that science fiction bend that was kind of missing all the time. This new obsession with like, how the same way the Fantastic Four and Hulk and Spider-Man are all these characters who get their powers from these science fiction sources. Like, yeah, he is that new wave,
right?
Kind of, and he's kind of quintessential to it. He's he and Green Lantern are both sort of the best versions of that.
Sure, and the science fiction components of that. But but when we get down to it again, the Flash is really similar to Superman in a way that even Green Lantern isn't. Like, Green Lantern is power-wise like similar to Superman in the sense of the raw potency of their abilities, even though they have very different powers that they have in their disposal. But the Flash is really similar in concept. Like, he's got a similar love life situation. He again has all the classic Superman situations in his civilian identity of having to be in two places at once and having to sneak around and do all these things. These are all things that Flash can deal with. Like, they have similar kind of situations because like Flash is a reporter girlfriend also, and like they're like like the Flash is just so similar, especially the Barry Allen Flash, like more so than Wally or Jay or Bart. Jesse in different ways. Jesse has some similarities to Superman in that she also has super strength, but and can fly. But Barry is Jesse can run on air just like her dad, and she.
I was gonna say Johnny can do that too, right?
Yeah.
That's like a thing that they can. Yeah.
When you say 3x2 9yz4a, all of a sudden you're just able to move at super speed and run on air.
That was impressive. I didn't know that. That was impressive to pull that out like that.
It is embarrassing how much I have like practiced saying that out loud. just in case. Just in case.
That's pretty impressive.
Just wait. It only needs to work one time.
but anyway, Barry, I just think is a very similar character in concept to Superman, but he's the Silver Age update to that. And you can see when you look at the two of them at the starting line, like Superman is blue with a red cape, and Flash is much sleeker with this like red bodysuit, and they have these distinct silhouettes from each other. But you're like, okay, yeah, this is the iterative process of comic books right here, and Superman is this like this broad set of powers that we discuss as being like very, very classic to the Golden Age kind of thing. Versus when you get to the Silver Age, characters really enjoy having specific singular powers that you can build upon and have these like big power sets that are all speed based in this case, or like fire based in the Human Torch's case, or web based in Spider-Man's case. Like you can. It is an avenue to creativity by way of restricting things, as opposed to Superman, where you have to be very creative to be like, well, if you can do literally fucking everything, like how do you tell a creative and interesting story? Like you have to find a way to restrict it in some way, or to be clever in some way, and a restriction is just making them run, and then all of a sudden you're just dealing with a Flash.
Yeah, I think you said a lot of interesting things. And the similarity between the Flash and Superman, which brings them into the same conflict over and over again, I think is the reason that I like them both. I said I've been a Flash fan for a long time. I was definitely a naysayer on Superman for a while. And I would say, I mean, I've been into Superman, reading Superman stuff, and a big fan of the character for more than 10 years, which is a long time to some people, but a short time in the time that I've been reading comic books, right? It's taken me a long time to come around on Superman and be like, I think that there is so much depth here. But one of the things that made me really fall in love with him, and there are many things I love about the character, but one of the things I really fall in love with him is the same reason I love the Flash, and it's the question for both of them is like, when you can do anything, what do you do? Because that's not a question for Batman. Batman is very limited, and he does all he can. So the question is, how far can he push himself, right? That's a thing for Batman's character. And then for other characters have other kind of limitations. But for Superman and for Flash, there kind of seems to be no limit to what they can accomplish. They can be in all places at once. Superman can withstand any threat. Flash can respond to any threat. Flash can travel through time to fix mistakes that have happened, and we've seen the consequences of that. I think that they both have that question of like, well, you can do anything, right? You don't have any limits. The rest of us have limits. It's a power fantasy in that way, to be able to accomplish all the things you'd want to be able to do.
Yes, exactly.
Flash can save everyone from the building, and then he can go speed read how to build a building, and then create one for everyone so they have a new home, all in under 20 seconds. There's this power, like, well, you can do anything. What do you do then? Where do you draw the line, and how do you use it? And I think they're both super interesting. For me, it started with the Flash, and I loved him for that reason. I loved his stories, and I've come to realize that Superman is much the same way. And I've come to really love Superman as, to me, he's the ultimate father character in all of media, and I'm obsessed with that.
And you can kind of see that is the evolution of comic heroes in general. And so we're just getting back to the roots, where like the very literal prototype of superheroism, and then a very early offshoot, which are both compelling in ways that are just going to remain as such. It's a story that we want to keep telling, and these are two iterations on that we want to root for, and then root for against each other in a race. It's going to keep happening.
Yeah. We want them both to win, and honestly, they often do.
Yeah. Who's the real winner? Us.
And I will say though, so in the animated series, the race never ends because they're dealing with Weather Wizard, and so it ends with like, oh, let's do another race. We never find out who wins. But in Justice League Unlimited, the episode where they visit the Flash Museum, there is a display referencing the race, and it does declare Flash as the winner. So,
I mean, technically, he should never lose any of those races, but Superman's the best. Well, that's all there is to it. The end.
I mean, it kind of depends. Like, I honestly think that he should have lost like that first race of Wally post-crisis. Like, I think that the fact that he won is impressive for Wally and speaks to his like secret like greater power. But like if Superman is going to keep up with Wally now, he should have easily won in the race at that point. Just because that's, you know, again, the issue of the Flash always being the barometer for how fast characters are.
Yeah,
Yeah, man, it's so interesting how this primal, you know, the races are weird. Like I was thinking about this every time I like each issue. Like certain artists are better at it than others, but like races are hard to do in a comic and make compelling. You know, like some of the ones that are really good are just because there's so much going on in the individual issues. Like that first race in issue 199, like that's a Kurt Swan issue, and Kurt Swan is like a great figure drawn or like illustrator, but he's not necessarily the most dynamic action drawing or action drawing person, action penciler, action art illustrator. I have the words for it. I don't need to be like drawing person.
The boy's stiff.
Yeah,
you know,
a little bit.
But the boys be stiff in that issue.
A little, and it's not that he has bad figures. Like look at the cover, and like you can see that like there's good dynamism in like the poses for the characters, but just like it's not Jack Kirby in terms of just like the, you know, the raw energy of each panel. And the reason why that issue is interesting is because there's so much fucking going on in every single page. Like,
yes, dense.
It is extremely dense. And so like the shots of the race are almost incidental because there's so much fucking story happening throughout the whole thing. And like you get artists like Howard Porter or with Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, who is, you know, an infamous DC illustrator. Infamous is the wrong word because he's famous. He's the one who basically did all their merch designs for the 80s and 90s because he's just like such a clean penciler. You know, we get good pencilers working on this that are doing dynamic jobs to tell the story, but running is difficult to convey when there is no actual motion.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird that, you know, the punch has effect, right? There's the puncher and the punchy, and so I think it's maybe a little easier to convey how dynamic that is. And yeah, with running, you really got to be like, if you just draw someone in a comic running the way humans run, it's going to look like a casual jog.
Yeah,
you know, you really got to stretch and pull it, and it takes a lot of creativity to make it dynamic and interesting, I think.
Yeah, and not to say that it is easy to make it look interesting in, say, movies or TV. Like the history of the special effects in all these like Flash TV shows and movies and the Smallville episode
not great.
The characters. It's difficult to make it look that compelling.
You didn't like John Wesley Shipp's Flash from the 90s?
You know, they were doing the best job they could at the time. But
I thought it was all right, honestly. I watched a lot of that.
But and, the special effects, like just making running with super speed look good is difficult, and like that's why so many movies have recently settled in on just like having slow-mo around a character moving at normal speed, because that's the only way to like kind of sell it and have it not look completely insane, because having a character move really fast just like look we've seen the shots of Grant Gustin running sometimes where it's just like that it just looks weird.
Yeah, it's tough. I do not envy them. Those special effects people with their air cannons to make it look like he just ran out of the room.
Yeah, races are hard to illustrate in general, and they're hard to do in comics. They're easier to do in some other formats. Like I think that like the animated series did a really good job with it because it has the benefit of being an animated series. You can just show them run on water and like sell that they're both fast enough to run on water. And it looks
great.
Yeah,
like the way they run on it, and then there's the big plume of water kind of delayed. Looks awesome.
Yeah, very very good effects there. Like.
Which Superman does fly in that episode, by the way. Part of that race, he does fly, so it's not even fully a foot race.
Well, he flies when they start like helping things.
I guess you're right. Yeah.
When they're officially doing the race, they're running, because that's why we have Superman running on water in that sequence. But yeah, I mean, like speaking of which, we get the tried and true. We've got the charity race format in that one going for them, and we also have the tried and true. There's a sensor on the character that allows us to track them, and thus is drawing power for some nefarious plot. In this case, Weather Wizard. I'm surprised it wasn't Abracadabra. In retrospect,
it feels like it's such a weird like. Yeah, it's Weather Wizard that looks like shit. This costume's terrible.
Right.
It's like such a, I don't know. I know like it's a Superman show. You're like, I mean, Wither-Wiz is gonna be one and done. We're not bringing this guy back. But yeah, it does feel like Abracadabra would have been equally appropriate. But whatever.
Yeah.
They always use Weather Wizard in like the most random episodes because you'll have this one, and I think later on in like Justice League, I think it's Justice League Unlimited. He's in the Hereafter. It's like part of like power trio that sends Superman to the future.
Oh, is that the interesting?
Oh, was he? Yeah.
It's like was it or he
Yes,
meets Vandal Savage
great,
2,000 years
great
in the future.
episode.
Such a
All I
great
remember from
episode.
that is it's Toyman though who does the sending. But
Yeah.
that's interesting that he was part of that too.
So much. It's such a good episode.
So long story short, the animated series did a really good job illustrating this. All these other ones, like we have artists who are doing really good work, but it is hard to make a race like look that compelling because otherwise you're just showing people in kind of like static poses because by the very nature of comic book panels, they're freeze frame. Like look at the Michael Turner cover for the Flash 209. It's supposed to be a shot of the JLA chasing the Flash, but like does it really look like anything necessarily? Like Michael Turner's a great artist, but like the Flash running is just when it is a still frame, it is a person in an action pose, and in this scenario, it's the JLA like all coming up behind him. You know, selling it is its own challenge there, and like making it interesting. Some of these have done a great job of it. Some of these have been less amazing at making the race interesting. But it is a compelling thing that we want to see a really good version of because they are both so fast and like there's something just like primal about like who is faster. Like let's watch a race. Let's like the Olympics are popular for a reason.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, it is kind of, it's sort of the ultimate superhero sporting event other than, I guess, strengthening, which is kind of a thing, but there's so many strong characters. This is just so much more unique and interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to your point that, drawing the Flash is an unenviable task. I wonder if there is any, like, credence, I wonder if there is any, like, I feel like certain characters, certain books get kind of this weight to them, and they're like, oh, it takes a special artist. Like, we're only going to put someone really special or hot or new or something on Spider-Man, right? Because that's a big book. I wonder if there's any people who are like, man, don't get on the Flash. Like, you got to draw people running all the time. It's a nightmare.
I wonder. I mean, like I said, I've read a lot of like what Howard Porter's writing specifically about working on the Flash, but he was just like praising it coming off of working on the Ray. So I think some artists who really gravitate towards working on the Flash figure out a niche in terms of selling the speed, like whether it's like drawing the lightning around them, the speed lines, like whatever kind of thing to like really kind of sell it. And if you don't have that, then like what are you doing?
Yeah, I've always been partial. Now we're just talking about Flash artists we like, but I've always bit partial to Manipul and Buccellato. I always thought they added a great dynamism, and just the layouts of those comics really helped to sell how fast he was moving.
It's a challenge, but when you get a really good artist who has that dynamism, it really is a treat. For me, like Humberto Ramos with Impulse was always a big one because I thought that he did a really good job of selling a character who just like basically teleported around as like this puckish trickster type character. Mm-hmm. So that was always a big one for me.
Yeah, a character who can't stand not to be there, right? Like has to be in all places at once. Like D&D players when you split them up and they're like, wait, okay, you gotta be there too? I want to say something.
Right, exactly. On that note, Austin, why don't we wrap up this conversation and give you some space to plug what you've got going on? So you mentioned D&D. Where can people find you and follow you?
Yes, certainly. So the big project I'm a part of is I am the DM, GM, occasionally player on my very lucky days on Rolling with Difficulty. So it's an actual play, mostly D&D podcast. We do some other systems every now and again, but mostly D&D podcast. I'm the GM and I play with, if you've listened to this podcast, then you know Red from Overly Sarcastic Productions. I play with her and Sophia, who has also been on the show. I also play with her. She's our producer and a player. So you can check that out if you like actual plays. It's very, I find it very comic book inspired. I set it in very science fantasy. It's set in the Planescape. It's set in the Spelljammer kind of settings. I tend to pull a lot from my comic book sources, I think, for inspiration. So if you like D&D and you like comic books, which of course you do, you're listening to this podcast, maybe give it a look. And so that's rolling with difficulty. And then if you care to follow me on social media, where I don't do all that much, but occasionally will say something pithy, I think, I'm at the Funk. So that's at the Funk on Blue Sky and the sinking ship that is X. I am still there watching the string quartet play as it goes down in a blaze of glory.
Especially nowadays, it's so hard to like go back to the hell site that is formerly known as Twitter, because there was something special even though it was a hell site, and now it's a hell site that's sold its soul. But we got Blue Sky, and you can find all of us on Blue Sky. So find Austin there, and then come find me at Case Aiken on Blue Sky. And Jmike, where can they find you?
j5.bluesky.social. I found this person that posts nothing but space pics of like from the Hubble telescope, and it's like the most amazing thing ever.
Cool.
That's awesome.
Red loves space stuff. Red is always letting me know about what space thing is happening. It's like, that's very cool. I'm inside right now.
So cool. These pictures are amazing.
That's awesome. Like that's a bit of positivity right there that the world needs right now. So yeah, you should check us all out on Blue Sky. If you have to, I am still on Twitter at Case Aiken, or you can go to Instagram where you can find me at Quetzalcoatl5, because I am still holding on to my Ames 3 name from high school, and I was pretentious then and am pretentious now. So haha. But more realistically, you should come to our Discord server and come interact with us there. You can find a link on our website at certainpov.com. All over the internet. I post the Discord link constantly. It's in most of my profiles. So, and then after you check out our Discord server, you can circle it back and check out our next episode. But until then, stay super, man.
Men of Steel is a Certain POV production. Our hosts are Jmike Folson and Case Aiken. The show is edited by Sophia Ricciardi. Our logo is by Chris Batista, and episode art is by Case Aiken. Our theme is by Geoff Moonen.
Are you tired of watching your beloved characters being tortured by careless authors?
Are you sick of feeling like they could have swapped out all of the painful action and the plot would remain untouched? Subscribe to Books That Burn, the fortnightly book review podcast focusing on fictional depictions of trauma.
We assume that the characters' reactions are reasonable and focus on how badly or well they were served by their authors.
Join us for our minor character spotlights, main character discussions, and favorite non-traumatic things in the dark books we love.
Find us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.